Good morning and welcome to the Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy February walk. Today is February 10th and we are at actually at Abalone Cove Preserve parking lot, but we will be heading for Sacred Cove, which is the area and beach behind Portuguese Point. You'll be walking along, mostly along the drive, first down here away from the Palos Verdes Drive south and then over and down a very steep trail. I have the great privilege this morning to have Bob Douglas with us. Dr. Douglas is a professor at USC of Earth Sciences and has been gracious enough to lead this walk and introduce the geology. Sacred Cove is one of the premier spots on the peninsula for geology, so this will be a fascinating walk, and I hope you really all enjoy it and have a great walk. And hopefully we'll see you next month. I think how many of you have been on these walks before? All right, most of you hopefully know about the Conservancy. We do these monthly walks every second Saturday of the month, and all over the peninsula. We are an organization that is non-political, that is preserving open space on the peninsula and the entire peninsula. We've been very successful thanks to the help of the peninsula citizens and others that feel open space is important. And so we hope that if you're not a member, that you will join the Conservancy in this great effort and enjoy. I don't have to tell you, we're obviously in a very beautiful area, and we hope that you keep coming to our walks and share with us. We're glad to have you with us. So have a great walk, and Dr. Douglas will explain all the details of geology to you on the way down.
My name is Bob Douglas. I'm a geologist. I'm at University of Southern California, and also I'm a local resident here. I live just up the hill here a little ways, and so sort of taking a walk in our backyard in a sense, which is very nice. This morning what we're going to do is to look at a number of things. In particular, we're going to take a look at the rocks and a little bit of the geology along the way. And so I thought before we started, I would give you just a little bit of a background to maybe better understand some of what we're looking at, and we'll explain it more as we go along. If you drive along this side of the peninsula here, you see all these sedimentary rocks exposed. And those sedimentary rocks are what geologists call the Altamira Shale. And they are widely exposed around the peninsula, and particularly along this side. There's another kind of rock that is exposed here now that's also very important to the geology, and these are what we call basaltic rocks, and that is, they are what you might think of as lava. They are the same kind of material. If you go to Hawaii, you see it's coming out of the volcano there. These rocks are very important because their distribution along the coastline has a great influence on the coastline. All of these points, like you see here behind us at Abalone, at Portuguese Bend Point and the others, are all the result of erosion, and the fact the points are there is because these basalts are much harder than the sedimentary rocks, and so they get preserved, and so they stand out. It turns out that the basalts are actually what we call intrusive rocks. If you can imagine when the sedimentary rocks were being formed on the sea floor, and at that time we had these molten materials come from deep. They came all the way up almost to the surface, and then when they got to the surface they spread out laterally, and we call these sills. And so these basalts here are what we call sills, and they're intrusive. They have come from great depth, and when they were implanted they were very hot. And so they heated the water, which was in the sediments and the seawater, and they caused a lot of hydrothermal alteration. And so one of the key features of these rocks we're going to take a look at will be the fact that they have been altered. Sometimes they made the rocks around them harder, and then sometimes they didn't. So point here is made up of one of these basalts. You can't see it because it's in the shadow right now, but as we go around to the other side, the sunny side, you'll be able to see it really quite well. These basalts are all along the southern and to some degree the northern part of the peninsula. And in some places, when these basalts came from great depth, they formed sort of pods in the seafloor, fairly thick pods. For example, recent drilling here shows that these basalts are more than 300 feet thick beneath us. If you go up to Point Vicente, you see all those alterations in the rocks along the road. That's because that's another place where the basalts were very thick. And those of you, for example, who've been over to Forrestal, to the old quarry over there, that's what they were coring, was this basaltic material, and it was very thick there. So there are various places along the southern flank of the peninsula where these basalts were very thick, and they gave out these lateral, what we call sills. And right here there are two horizons. There's one which is near the surface, which is in fact what the point is made of, and in a few places just behind us here on the hillside, erosion has exposed it. And then there's a deeper layer. There's a deeper layer, it's about 100 feet below that, that extends all across this side of the peninsula. So we're going to take a look at some of these features that are associated with it. And do I have another one of the docents with me? I guess they're back there. They also know a lot about fauna and flora, and so they will give you some information about that as we sort of walk along. So before we start, anybody have any questions on anything? If not, then why don't we start and we'll walk over towards Sacred Cove. Yes?
You know, this point here,
If you look over to the point, you can see a couple things. First off, notice that the point is very flat on top. Very flat. As a matter of fact, the surface that we're on right here where the parking lot is, it's pretty flat. And if you go around the peninsula, you'll see a number of these places which are almost flat, usually at the top of the sea cliff. These are what we call a marine terrace, a marine terrace. And they're very interesting because if you look at the bottom of the sea cliff, you can see the rocks there, and particularly when it's low tide, you'll see there's a flat surface there. It's formed by wave erosion. Over time, the waves cut away at the base of the cliff and they erode down to sea level. And it turns out that this flat surface on top of the point was created the same way. It's an ancient marine terrace, and it was created when two things happened. One, that sea level was a little bit higher than what it is right now, but in particular is when the peninsula was lower. The peninsula as a whole, it's like like a giant block, is being uplifted. And so over time, these features then get elevated and they're away from the sea floor, or to me, the sea level where they were formed. And so it's a marine terrace, and if you look around the peninsula, you'll find there are a whole series of these marine terraces. I like to tell my students that the first people to appreciate them were developers. You see, because they're nice and flat and they're right next to the ocean, you just build houses on them. So here in Palos Verdes, the early developers, they appreciated marine terraces even though they didn't know what they were looking at. So, but the interesting thing is that this marine terrace here was formed 120,000 years ago. 120,000 years ago. That was the last time when the Earth's climate was in what we call an interglacial phase like it is right now, where ice at the poles was minimized. After that, between 120 and about 20,000 years ago, ice grew at the poles, and that ice grew because the water came out of the ocean, and so sea level went down. So roughly 120,000 years ago, sea level was out there at the edge of the present continental shelf, about 120 to 130 feet below where it is right now. So the terrace on top of the hill gives us another point. You see, just behind the terrace, there's a hill. That hill is the toe of the ancient landslide. And we know that that terrace existed when that landslide came and ran on top of it. And so it tells us that the landslide is less than 120,000 years old. And so you oftentimes hear people talking about the Portuguese Bend and Abalone Cove landslides being 100,000 years or so in age. That's how that comes about. So that sort of funny little hill there actually turned out to be some more basalt, but it's the toe of an ancient landslide that overran the terrace when the terrace was at sea level. So all of that took place in the last about 120,000 years. Yeah. You can't see the point very well because it's in the shade, It looks yellow from here, but if you get up close, you'd find it was a blue-gray color, and that's blue-gray to black color, and that's the color of these basalts and whatnot. So, okay, well, let's walk on, and we'll walk on over to Sacred Cove. Anybody notice anything as we walk from the top of that hill to where we are right now? Well, it's hotter. Yeah, that's true. We just passed over the edge of the Abalone Cove landslide. We are now in the Abalone Cove landslide. It's right behind you. This little bit of a dip that you see going across, and it goes across the road and goes right through the Wayfarers Church and then on up the hill and whatnot. And it comes down the other side, along the side of the peninsula here that sticks out. So from over there, goes up and then comes back down on this side. Actually, this is the part of the landslide which is moving most rapidly right now. In about the last 15 years, it's moved roughly 20 inches, something like that. Doesn't sound dramatic, but if you have a house in the middle of that, why, you think it's pretty dramatic, yeah. You will see if you walk around in here, for example, a lot of cracks in the ground. We call them fractures, and so you'll see those. If you go over into the Portuguese Bend landslide, you'll see lots of fractures over there, and they're much bigger because the movement there is dramatically greater. Along the road, it's moving at the rate of tens of feet a year. And so if you look between the road and the sea and the ocean, you'll see those big cracks and stuff over there. So it's really become quite unstable as a result. So anyway, there are a couple other things I'll point out as we just move along our way.
What's creating the landslide?
What's creating the landslide? That's a good question. The thing is that it's a combination of factors. Sort of geology sets up the conditions, and groundwater is what facilitates it. And if you can see the point now, you see how the white band there sort of dips off towards the ocean? Well, it turns out all the rocks are dipping towards the ocean. And so when you cut a sea cliff, you can think about this material as dipping towards the ocean, and then you cut the sea cliff, which means you remove lateral support. And so gravity is pulling on it, and it wants to move down towards the ocean. And when you build up groundwater within it, it tends to help that process. And I mentioned a minute ago that we are now standing in the middle of the Abalone Cove landslide. Someone asked me how landslides form, and I said, well, geological conditions are the basic framework, but what activates them is groundwater. Groundwater tends to add a lot of weight to the subsurface. Also, it tends to remove the frictional effects which hold the rocks in place. And so one of the most effective means by which you can combat landslides is to remove the groundwater. And that's exactly what this sort of very common looking thing over here, this is a dewatering well. It's a well in which we have drilled down through the landslide to extract groundwater. And it's connected to a line which then ultimately dumps the water into the ocean. We currently operate around 23 such dewatering wells all across the Abalone Cove landslide and just above it. And right now the wells are pumping about 250,000 gallons a day. Yeah, so they remove about 250,000 gallons a day of groundwater, which then we just return to the ocean. And it's turned out to be pretty effective, except for very small movements in the Abalone Cove landslide, which occurs when we have very, very heavy rains. Otherwise, the rest of the time, it's pretty stable. So removal of groundwater is one way in which you can improve the stability of things like landslides, and particularly areas which are prone to landslide. So it's an important thing. They don't look like much, but they turn out to be, in a sense, real lifesavers.